Well, greetings and welcome to the final week of history. Don't cheer too bad, you'll give me a complex. This is week 28, the final week, and we have three more lessons, and we'll discuss them Monday in class. And again, you have, when we meet in class Monday, you'll have 1 week to turn in your final assignment of the year, the top 10 list of best Dark Ages, early medieval things, according to you. So, looking forward to seeing what y'all write. In our final three lessons, we're going to cover three very different things. If you look at the globe, there's really, outside of Antarctica, only one part of the globe we haven't looked at during this time period. Again, the focus, again, is on Western Europe because that's the part of the world that directly led to where we are at this point in time. The one section of the world we have not really looked at to this point. It's a pretty large one. It's South America, which is a huge landmass, and we haven't really talked about it yet. The reason is that the indigenous peoples that certainly populated South America during this almost millennium period, actually closer to 1,500 years that we're looking at, they none of them had a written language that we know of. There are no surviving documents. There are, the few trinkets here and there that we see from old indigenous civilizations, but there's no diaries, documents, or literature that survived this period. Certainly, they had great stories to tell, great heroes, villains, circumstances, but they are unfortunately lost to the ages. We only have vague clues about the various indigenous groups that lived throughout this vast continent of South America. That began to change in the 15th century, about more or less 1438, with the emergence of the Inca Empire. We usually spell it I-N-C-A. Your book spells it I-N-K-A. Doesn't really matter. They lived along the west coast of South America, which has some wild, differing terrain. To the south, there's the Andes Mountains, one of the most impressive mountain ranges in the world, really second only to the Himalayas in terms of height. They also had the Atacama Desert, which is technically the driest desert on Earth. Nothing, not even cactus, will grow there. But there was a civilization that grew up in this odd terrain called the Incas, and they called their homeland Tawana Mitsayu, which meant land of four quarters, because their empire was neatly arranged into four regions. The first Incan figure, uniter, quote unquote, if you want to call it that, is Pachacuti, called the Earth Shaker, and he was someone who moved worlds. He actually was the son of a king, but he was not the direct heir. He was the second in line, and he became a warrior prince and began conquering other tribes around the region. And in doing so, he became a great hero, and great enough to basically oust his brother from the throne and rule this emerging Incan empire. He spent 10 years battling even more scattered tribes after assuming the rulership. And again, at times he was ruthless, but he was militarily very sharp. No evidence that he ever really lost a battle at all. And to his credit, rather than when he conquered a civilization, he didn't erase it from the earth. He took its best elements and incorporated it into the Incan Empire. You'll remember we talked about Genghis Khan, and during his conquering, he was very ruthless, but he also incorporated the thinkers, the great warriors, and joined them into his collective. And so the existing Incas learned new things from other tribes as well, and became very formidable. Such so, in 20 years, Pachacuti basically turned over the day-to-day rule of the empire to his son while he began building a great capital city called Cusco. And that means navel in the language of the Incans. and it was seen as the belly button of their society. Again, the map shows their empire was vast. It stretched from Bolivia, modern day Bolivia, to Argentina, all the way up to Peru, and it's in Peru where we see a lot of the artifacts. Cusco was a spectacular city, and it is so cool. They laid out the shape of this city in the shape of a puma, like a panther, which was kind of a sacred animal to the Incans. They at the head of the puma sat their fortress called Sacsayhuaman. I won't ask you to remember that, but again, a couple of notes about this. The stones in the walls of this part of the city are so well laid that a knife can't pass between them, even though they had no mortar. These were some expert brick cutters, and it still stands today. That's how well made this place was. The body of the puma was shaped by two small rivers. They merged in the southwest corner of town to form the tip of the puma's tail. All of the city was significant, but the located at the tail was called the Temple of the Sun. Much of it was made of pure gold. Again, we've talked about some of the wonders in China when people went there and they saw things made of pure jade. This is pure gold, okay? Gold. You get the idea. The Temple of the Sun was meaningful because Pachacuti made worship of the sun the official religion of the Incans. Pachacuti went a little too far. He started deeming himself a god. No one was allowed to look him in the eye. His spit was collected as treasure. Hair that fell from his head was eaten by attendants. His old clothes and leftover food were burned so no one else could sully it. This guy had very much delusions of grandeur. Really, at the heart of the Incan society geographically was Lake Titicaca, and it is the highest lake in the world. As you can see from the picture, it's basically a body of water settled in amongst the mountain ranges. It's something like 12,000 feet high is the lake level, which is just remarkable. It contains 25 islands, one of them called the Island of the Sun, the other called the Island of the Moon. According to the Incan legend, this is where the Incan civilization was born. Lord only knows how it was really born. It was, again, like most societies of its time, it was an unfair social system insofar as if you were born a peasant, you were probably going to die a peasant, but it was a fairly efficient empire. Much like the Romans, they improved the calendar, they innovated the first legal system that South American continent had ever seen. They had roads, about 15,000 miles of highways connecting these mountains. They had public works projects, swinging bridges, in some cases that are still there between these high mountains. But really the most lasting part of the Incan civilization is Machu Picchu. You might have heard of it. It is an amazing story. It was a city built by the successor to Pachacuti, who wanted to have a place for not just the nobility, but the thinkers, the engineers, the masons, people who were very skilled tradesmen, were very prized in Incan society. And it is still a breathtaking sight. It is just an amazingly laid out little mini city. The most remarkable thing about Machu Picchu is that it lay undiscovered for about 450 years. It was built about 1460, we think. But when the Spanish conquistadors came to South America, they wiped out the Incan population. They had 12 million people. By the time the Spanish were done with them, it was down to about 1 million. So Inca's civilization as such was pretty well trashed, but not Machu Picchu. It was hidden in the hills. I mean, it was tucked away in the middle of nowhere, and it lay undiscovered for 450 years. Even after the formation of what we now know as the South American nations and whatnot, everything else, this mammoth place was hidden. It was so remote. It was not discovered until the year 1911 by an American explorer. And they began to put two and two together and dated this. Okay, this is from the Incan Empire. And then they put clues from other manuscripts and, this is the place they were referring to, Machu Picchu. We found it. And so now it's probably one of the biggest tourist attractions in all of South America, but it lay undiscovered for 450 years. It was amazing. Oddly enough, the Incans never made much use of some basic technology, Stone Age technology, like the wheel. It never caught on, even though it's just a very basic design. Never really caught on in Incan society. Again, they were practically annihilated by the Spaniards. That's a story we'll cover later in history, but there are still people who trace their lineage back to the Incan Empire, and their culture is still very much celebrated in circles today. And of course, Machu Picchu, a lasting testament to this civilization. Let's go back to not quite Europe, but the line straddling Europe and Asia. We're going to talk about the Ottoman Turks, a dynasty or an empire, Ottoman Empire, born in the mid-15th century, which lasted until well into the 20th century. In doing so, we're going to take a little refresher course on some people and events that we had talked about before. Consider this kind of a review, but it will help you understand the dynamics behind this area we're talking about. We're talking about modern-day Turkey and vicinity, really kind of around the Black Sea. You'll remember we talked about Paul's missionary journeys. Something like 6 of the major stops he made were cities that would eventually be part of the Ottoman Empire. So we know they were Christian at one point, but the Ottoman Empire was Islamic. So you can see some conflict forming there. Let's fast forward about 400 years and talk about our old friend Constantine. You remember the Edict of Milan, which freed Christians from Roman persecution? Constantine was also the one who created the city of Byzantium. He moved the Roman Empire's capital from Rome to Byzantium, and it was renamed Constantinople after him. And, of course, influenced the future Byzantine Empire, which, of course, was created with the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It offered the formation of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. So we're all still talking about this same area of land. Again, modern-day Turkey, around the Black Sea. You will remember Justinian and Theodora, the rags-to-riches couple who transformed Constantinople in the 9th century AD into a beautiful and spectacular city. They built the Hagia Sophia, the great Christian church, which was just the envy of the world at the time. A few centuries later, Genghis Khan's sweep through Asia forced a group called the Ottomans, a very small group, who were in Persia, even modern-day Iran, things like that. They fled in advance of the Golden Horde and went into modern-day Turkey. It was there they encountered, here we go, back into our memory banks again, the Seljuk Turks. You'll remember them as the particularly militant Islamic group who invaded Jerusalem and caused the original crusade because of their cruelty, killing all Christians and Jews in Jerusalem. The Seljuk Turks, and they were a constant thorn in Jerusalem's side, even under Saladin's rule. The Seljuk Turks were particularly militant. Well, the Ottomans found shelter among the Seljuk Turks living around the Black Sea, and eventually the Ottomans, who still kept their identity, began to conquer the Seljuks and declared themselves the ruling empire of this region. Their first emperor was Osman I, and after controlling most of what we now call the mainland of Turkey, they decided to circle around the Black Sea and get a little bigger. That's when they came to the Balkan Peninsula, modern-day Montenegro, Albania, Bulgaria, former Yugoslavia, etc. They encountered a similar race, similar culture, but they were Christian, not Islamic. Well, that was bound to bring problems, and it most certainly did. They exerted really economic and political pressure in this region. It was very uncomfortable to be a Christian or a Jew living in the Balkan Peninsula. And these cities that Paul visited began falling one by one to Islam. The last holdout was the main city, Constantinople. Osman's successor, Muhammad II, not the prophet, but the Ottoman king, eventually conquered Constantinople in 1451. He had 150,000 soldiers attacking a city with about 8,000 defenders. Yeah, it's hard to conquer. It was hard to militarily to beat out someone who's rooted in, but yeah, you got a 12-1 advantage. I like your chances. The Constantinople held out for about 54 days, but they pleaded with the West to send help. None came, and their emperor at the time was killed in battle, and so that was pretty much the end of the Byzantine Empire and the beginning of the Ottoman Empire. The Hagia Sophia, the great church, was looted and turned into a mosque, and the Ottoman Turks, as they're now called, renamed the city Istanbul, which it is called today. Because of this, from this region, the artists, scientists, thinkers, professors began to flee. This was not a friendly society for them, and they mostly went to Western Europe, and really, along with what we'll talk about in a minute, really helped fuel what we would call the Renaissance. Again, the Ottoman Turks were actually a participant in World War I. To let you know how long the empire lasted, it was more or less dissolved after the armistice that ended World War I. It was a shell of its former self then anyway, and Turkey was recognized as an independent sovereign nation. Just to let you know that the Ottoman Empire lasted a while. Our final lesson probably focuses on the most important technological innovation that we've talked about all year. Again, the printing press was not the most creative or imaginable thing. It was not something that only a freaking genius could come up with. The impact of it, though, was incalculable. Johannes Gutenberg was born in Mainz, Germany in, oh boy, I thought I had the year here, like 1388 or something like that. Anyway, what was unique about Gutenberg was his background. He grew up in a fairly wealthy family. His father was an aristocrat in Mainz, so that means Gutenberg could read, which put him in the top 7% of the world at the time, and he was very curious about books, and books were not readily available. Again, we know why. They all had to be hand transcribed. It took a monk. The old saying was, takes a monk a year to translate to write a Bible. Well, there's only so many monks, and so anyway, one estimate was that before Gutenberg invented the printing press, there were 30,000 books available in Europe. Just keep that number in mind. He had an interesting background in that he worked with his hands a lot. He had experience as a goldsmither and as someone who operated a cheese press. He began to put these ideas together. Remember, our friends in China had a sort of movable type device earlier, centuries earlier, but two important distinctions. It was made of wood or porcelain, so it was not very distinctive. Plus, the Chinese language has thousands of characters. So what they would do in the Chinese is they would type entire words and use them. That was very cumbersome. Gutenberg's idea was, number one, to use metal, to forge it from iron, these little characters, and to make just singular letters. That way, you could create any word you wanted, space, anytime. There's a video I'll show you here real quickly that just shows you sort of the ins and outs of the printing press that he developed.
Around 1450, he began developing new techniques for improving the printing press. Gutenberg created a process using movable metal type, which meant that letters could be rearranged into countless patterns. This was faster and more accurate than any previous method. It made books and tracts much more affordable. Gutenberg's first major project was printing the Bible in Latin. By 1500, there were over 200 printing shops in Europe. It is estimated that between 8 and 20 million books were printed during those first 50 years. This type of printing press would lead to the mass production of the Bible. This meant that the Bible was more accessible and affordable to people than ever before. The effects of Gutenberg's invention were enormous. Ideas spread across Europe and the world faster than they ever had.
And quite frankly, it's impossible to overestimate the impact that the printing press had on Europe. You saw the numbers there. Gutenberg quickly learned he could print 200 to 300 copies of one page in a book in a day. And it took kind of a day to lay everything out just right. By 1456, he and his associates completed printing 300 copies of the Bible. If you have a copy of the Gutenberg Bible today, it is one of the most valuable artifacts on the planet. It is remarkable. They called it the 42-line Bible because each column contained exactly 42 lines of text. Within 20 years, every country in Europe had a printing press of their own. Within 50 years, there were more books and Bibles produced than in all the centuries of hand copying beforehand. Again, you saw the numbers. Within just 50 years, Europe went from 30,000 books to multi-million books. And of course, the book that was most distributed was the Bible. Gutenberg actually made a lot of money printing up indulgences for the Catholic Church. So, I mean, he wasn't above making a buck. But really, history was never the same. The sharing of information, having a common pool of knowledge, is how a person gets smarter and how a people get smarter. We've talked about this before. As recently as 120, 130 years ago, if you went to the doctor, the extent of that doctor's medical knowledge was him and whoever he learned from. That was it. They didn't have a way to share information. Today, if you have an odd diagnosis at Sova Health Danville, the doctor there can get on a conference call and within an hour be talking to 30 of the greatest medical minds on planet Earth, swapping ideas, not to mention the limitless access to information they have by way of the internet. So instead of your doctor have his or her span of knowledge being just what they've learned, you have the accumulated knowledge of every doctor. Now, ideas were shared, concepts were shared, Bibles were shared, and the world was never the same. We'll talk more about this on Monday. Just try to let your imagination run wild and think about a world without a printing press today, if you can. Anyway, we'll see you Monday. Take care.